From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome once again to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors around the world. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and educator living and working in Florence, Italy, in the city where all the great sculptors are dead. And I don't feel so well myself. And today, we're going to have a little bit of fun. Now, last year, when I covered the sculptor Benvenuto Cellini in a podcast, I read in character from his autobiography, and I had a lot of fun with it. And from that time on, I've been waiting to do it again. But sculptors' biographies, at least ones entertaining enough to read out loud, are few and far between. But even as far back as last year when I did Cellini, I knew that one day I was going to be reading from the Autobiography of Giovanni Dupr&e, and that is the subject of today's podcast. Now, Giovanni Dupr&e isn't a very well-known sculptor these days, not even really in Florence, which is where he spent his career. In fact, if it weren't for his autobiography and the autobiography's translation into English, I probably wouldn't even be doing a podcast on him. Not that he wasn't a significant sculptor. His work was groundbreaking in the 19th century, but the problem is that he did it in Florence and not in Paris. And so his significance had much less of an impact on the realm of art and got a lot less recognition than it deserved. But Giovanni Dupr&e was one of the earliest sculptors of the 19th century to work completely independently of the neoclassical style. Now, we know that this was first accomplished by François Rude in Paris with his Neapolitan Fisher Boy and his colossal relief on the Arc de Triomphe in the 1830s. But Giovanni Dupr&e was doing it in Florence with his most famous work, The Dying Abel, in 1840, right on the heels of François Rude and completely independently of him. But there is a huge fundamental difference in the way François Rude and Giovanni Dupr&e arrived at completely naturalistic sculptural styles and techniques. You see, François Rude, if you remember, he was the darling of the École des Beaux-Arts, having won the Prix de Rome only to spend 12 years in exile in Brussels for his support of the Emperor Napoleon. And it was in Brussels that this highly skilled and highly trained sculptor spent years consciously developing a technique of working from the living model that completely subverts much of what he had been taught at the École des Beaux-Arts. But Giovanni Dupr&e's path to naturalism in sculpture could not be more different. Far from being trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris or even at the Accademia di Firenze in Florence, Dupr&e was a woodcarver's apprentice, working since childhood on modest carvings and decorations, but with a burning desire to become a figurative sculptor. Ridiculed for his ambitions, Dupr&e nevertheless cobbled together an education of sorts from various minor local painters and sculptors who imparted technical skills to Dupr&e, but had little to offer in the way of aesthetics, taste, or historical or contemporary fashions in the realm of the fine arts. Giovanni Dupr&e's path to naturalism was just that. It was natural and instinctive. He had no neoclassical upbringing to rebel against. He only had his eyes and his hands and his common sense to guide him. And the result of this led him to a completely naturalistic naivete in his work, a style and aesthetic almost miraculously aligned with the most progressive intellects in the fine arts at the time. Now, many people are familiar with the story of how Auguste Rodin's statue, called The Age of Brass, was denounced as a life casting from the model, rather than modeled in clay by hand. Rodin was accused of this because his statue was so naively naturalistic, without any concessions to artificial style or taste. And that happened in the mid-1870s. But Giovanni Dupr&e was accused of exactly the same thing for exactly the same reasons over 30 years previous, in 1840. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. We'll hear all about this from Giovanni Dupr&e himself. Now, Dupr&e's book was published in Italian in 1876, and then published in 1886 in English under the title Thoughts on Art and the Autobiographical Memoirs of Giovanni Dupr&e. Now, you can find it in the public domain online. It's pretty easy to find, so you can read it for yourself. But before we begin the reading here, I want to give a few words on this autobiography and what we're going to hear today. First off, it's going to be a two-part episode. Next week, I'm going to continue the reading because there is just way too much great stuff in this book to do in a single episode. This is actually one of my all-time favorite sculpture books. I discovered it over a decade ago in the British Institute Library here in Florence, having never heard of Duprè, and I truly think it's a book every figurative sculptor should read, because Giovanni Duprè's experience in finding his way in sculpture, starting out as he did as a complete outsider to the official world of art, has so many parallels with my own experience and the experience, I am sure, of many of you listening. His desire to learn, his frustration in not being able to get the education that he really wanted, the doubts of his friends, the insults of his detractors, the obstacles of poverty, his need to have a day job when all he wanted to do was sculpt, and the incremental steps his career takes slowly, and sometimes forward, sometimes backwards. I find the life of Giovanni Duprè much more inspiring than the life of Michelangelo or Bernini, who both were handed every advantage possible from a very early age. Duprè had to fight to be a sculptor, and though his success in art is modest compared to many other sculptors I've covered, few sculptors' personal experiences are so relevant to my own. I have learned a lot from this little book, not only from Duprè's experiences, but also in the advice to young sculptors that he gives throughout the book. So, in this first reading, I'm going to cover the highlights of his struggle as a youth before he found widespread success. And in the second reading next week, I'm going to cover a few of his successes, as well as his really interesting and rocky relationship with the great Lorenzo Bartolini, in whose shadow Duprè's career can be contrasted and compared. But both readings together will only cover maybe 30 pages or so of the autobiography, and the book is over 400 pages long, so I'm really just giving you just the slightest taste. I may someday read the book cover to cover as an audiobook. I think it's that important and relevant to the figurative movement currently afoot. I think everyone really needs to be familiar with this text. But until that time, I encourage all of you to seek this book out and read it for yourself and share it with others. And so, without further ado, the Sculptor's Funeral Theater presents selections from the Autobiography of Giovanni Duprè. I have often thought that perhaps it would be well for me to leave some written memoirs of my life, not only for the sake of my family, but also for the young artists of the future. But I have hitherto been deterred from doing so by the fear of, lest I might seem to have been prompted by pride and vanity. Since, however, various notices of my life and my doings in art have been made public, it may not either be without interest, or indeed without a certain utility, if I ventured now to speak at length on these subjects. For it seems to me that these memoirs may not only serve as an encouragement to timid but well-disposed youths, but may at the same time be a severe admonition to those who, presuming too much on themselves, imagine that with little study and greater boldness they can wing their way up the steps of art instead of laboriously climbing them. My father was Francesco Duprè, the youngest son of Lorenzo Duprè, who came to Siena with the princes of Lorraine. My father was obliged to discontinue his studies and to set work to learn a trade, in order that he might earn his bread as soon as possible, and thinking to derive some advantage from the studies he had already made in drawing, he apprenticed himself to a woodcarver. Later, he married Victoria Lombardi of Siena, and she was my mother. I was born on the 1st of March, 1817, in Via San Salvatore, and lived in Siena until I was 4 years old. My family then removed to Florence, where my father went at the request of the woodcarver Signor Paolo Sani, to help him in the execution of some intaglio decorations of the Palazzo Borghese, which the prince was anxious to have finished within the shortest possible time. I grew up from a little boy going with my father to the shop, and when he gave me some of his designs of ornamentation, such as heads, arabesques, and friezes to copy, I was very happy. The time passed without my knowing it, and such was my delight in this occupation that I often put off the hour of supper or sleep and gave up any amusement for it. At home, we lived very poorly. My father earned little, for his work was badly paid, and by nature he was slow. My parents looked about to find me a shop, and I was finally placed in Borgo San Jacopo with the woodcarvers Gaetano Amanati and Luigi Pieraccini, who worked together. They were both very able men, certainly much more so than my father, who, poor man, owing to the constant requirements of family, had never been able to perfect himself in his art. In this shop figures were carved, so that I had before me models and teachers as well as incitement to work. My principals liked me, and I them, and I should have remained with them for who knows how long, had I not been carried off by another woodcarver. I was sent to Signore Antonio Manetti, who not only carved ornaments and figures in wood, but also worked in marble, and was occupied in restoring the facade of the cathedral. Signore Manetti was a man of no common genius. He designed and sculpted ornaments and figures with much facility and cleverness. But even with him I was not fortunate. He gave me a little Napoleonic eagle with thunderbolts in his claws to execute. For what it was intended I don't remember, but apparently I did not succeed in satisfying him. There were neither blows on the head nor bitter words, but with a certain haughty dignity he took my poor little eaglet in his hands and dashed it to the ground, breaking it into atoms in spite of the thunderbolts. Viewed from this long distance of time, this scene has a somewhat comic character, and must seem so, especially to one who hears it described. But for me, a poor little boy, anxious to learn and get on, so as to lighten as far as possible the burden on my father, who, poor man, earned little, it was quite another thing, and although I felt within myself that I was not a complete donkey, still, to see my work thrown thus brutally on the ground was so painful to me that it took away all my little strength. I wept in secret. He wished, however, to keep me with him still longer, and so I occupied myself in making angels and seraphim heads for churches. How dear to me is the remembrance of those times. My good will and desire to learn were indeed above my very poor condition. The difficulties of my profession did not discourage me. On the contrary, I felt a pleasurable, though distant, hope of surpassing my companions in figure work that they did so badly and laboriously. For this purpose, from that time, I gave all my efforts to the study of the human figure. I bought an album and kept it always with me, begged my friends to stand as models, and I drew their portraits. At first my attempts were not happy, but I was never tired, and after a time I acquired so much freedom that with a few strokes I could make a fair likeness. I was always at work, and the walls of our kitchen and dining room were all smudged over with charcoal. Naturally, there was no one to scold me for this unusual way of adorning the walls, for my mother, poor dear, was blind. My father was not there, and as I was the eldest, I was, as it were, the head of the family. Besides, though my mother could not see, she still knew of this strange practice of mine, and thought it better for me thus to occupy myself than to be playing with the boys in the street. In the meantime, however, many doubts and self-questionings arose within me. I knew that there was a school where one could really learn to draw and paint and make statues. Heavens, how delightful it would be to know how to make statues. In fact, I understood there was the Academy of Fine Arts, for so I had been told, and some of the fortunate young men who frequented this academy were my acquaintances, and had shown me their designs, which seemed to me most stupendous. I was no longer happy. The academy appeared to me in the most splendid and glowing colors. It seemed to me the haven, the landmark, the temple of glory, the throne of my golden dreams. I spoke of it to my mother with tears in my eyes. She mingled her tears with mine, but not, perhaps, so much from being persuaded to the necessity of such studies as from a desire to soothe me. She spoke about it to Signore Sani, who, I shall always remember, with his eyes fixed fiercely on me, made even more formidable under his silver spectacles, replied that to do all that there was to be done in his shop, it was enough to remain in the shop and have the wish to learn, Of this he was certain, but as to the work in the academy, he did not feel so sure, for, on the contrary, that would fill me with desires and cravings that I could not satisfy, owing to the poverty of my family, even admitting that I had the disposition to enable me to master these studies. And finally, he hinted at the danger there was of my being contaminated by my companions. My mother did not answer him. She said goodbye to me, and in her sightless eyes I saw the sadness within. She went out, and I set myself to work. The second festa of Easter, I was at Mass in the church of the Santi Apostoli nearby. Suddenly lifting my eyes, I saw facing me a dear young girl on her knees. Her face was in shadow as it was bent down, and the church was rather dark, but the features and general expression were chaste and sweet. I stayed there enchanted. That figure in her modest dress and humble attitude, so still, so serene, enraptured me. When Mass was finished, the people began to go away, but she remained on her knees. At last she rose and went out, and I followed her from afar. She stopped at a house on the door of which I saw the sign of a laundress. I could not believe that such a modest, serious young girl could be so employed, for, as a general thing, laundresses are rather frisky and provocative, turning their heads and glancing about, and sometimes very slovenly in their dress. In fact, the opposite of all that dear good creature was. From the first moment that I saw her, I felt for her a respectful admiration, a tranquil, serene, brotherly affection and trust. I was seized with an irresistible desire to love her, to possess her, and to have my love returned. Often, without her knowing it, I followed her at a distance, to assure myself of her bearing and her ways, and I always observed in her a chaste, serious, and modest nature. At last, I attempted to follow her nearer, and when she became aware of it, she hastened her steps and crossed to the other side of the street. I was disconcerted, but at the same time I felt contented. One day, however, I decided at any cost to speak to her and to open my heart to her, and as I knew the hour when she was in the habit of passing by the Piazza di San Biagio, where I was at work, I held myself in readiness, and as soon as I saw her, I went out and followed her, that I might draw this thorn from out of my heart. Yes, somehow I thought she would not take my offer amiss. She crossed the Loggia del Mercato and took the Via Condotta, and always I followed nearer and nearer. At last she became aware of this, stopped suddenly, turned, and without looking at me in the face, said,
"I want no one to follow me."
I stammered a few words, but with so much emotion in my voice that she stopped again, looked at me a moment, and said,
"Go home to your mother, and do not stop me again in the streets."
From that day, a great change took place in me. Companions, rioting, and billiards disappeared as by enchantment from my life. That same evening, I went to the laundry. I saw the mistress of it, and with an excuse of having some work to give her, I spoke to her casually and in a general way of the young girl whose name I did not know. But she, being very sharp, smiled and said,
"I guess Marina, certainly. I understand. But take care and mind what I say. Marina is such a well-conducted girl that she will not give heed to you."
"But I did not say that I wanted to make love to her."
"I know, but I understood it, and I repeat that she will not listen to you. And if you want to do well, you will never come here again. Here there is work and not love-making to be done. But if you like, you might go to her house and speak with the mother. Perhaps then, who knows? But I should say that nothing would come of it, and it would be better so. You are too young, and so is she. Now you understand? So go away, and goodbye."
The day after this, I went to Marina's house and found her mother, Regina. The house was a small one, but very clean. In a few words, I opened my heart to her and told her all, even of my having stopped Marina in the Piazzetta di Giuochi. Regina was a woman of about 40 years of age and a widow. She listened quietly to me until I got to the end, and then only blamed me for having stopped her daughter in the street. She added that she would think about it, but she did not conceal from me that she thought me too young. I hastened to tell her how much I made by my day's work and that I had a settled occupation. She then wished to hear about my family and showed a desire to know my mother, and after having spoken to Marina, she said she would allow me to come to the house of any evening 2 or 3 times a week. The two mothers talked a long time together while Marina put some things in order here and there about the room without going away, and you could see the embarrassment of the poor girl. I held one of my mother's hands in mine and kept my eyes on Marina, who never looked at me once. It was settled that I could go to the house 2 or 3 times a week without speaking of the time that was to elapse before the date of the wedding. Yes, I really was too young, as I was only 18. All these particulars may seem superfluous, and for most people they certainly are so, but I meant, and I said so from the first, that these memoirs should be destined for my family and for young artists, to whom I desire to show myself such as I am, even in all the truth and purity of the most tender of affections. And it is with a feeling of tender gratitude and painful sadness that I go back in my memory to those days of my meeting with her, the difficulties that arose to prevent our union, and the very great influence she had over me. Every other evening I saw the good and charming girl. I remained for only about an hour or so, such was her mother's desire, while both of them worked, her mother spinning and the daughter sewing together their long braids of straw. I talked to them of my work in the shop, of my studies, and of my hopes. Again returned to me stronger than ever that desire to do figure work, and a vague, persistent, and fierce hope to become a sculptor in marble. When, in various forms, I expressed these my thoughts, Marina, who was listening to me with her eyes on her work, looked up at me, and seemed to search in mine for the meaning of my words. Poor Marina, you did not then understand what agitated the heart of your young friend. Later you understood, and although full of fears, you did not discourage him. But enough, do not let us anticipate. One evening, we were standing at the window of our little parlor, which overlooked a garden which was not ours. On its ledge were some pots of flowers reaching out over the windows, and among the flowers was a plant of verbena, which she liked above all things. I talked to her of my studies, of my hopes, of the happiness I felt being near her, and all the time I was so close to her that our breaths were mingled together. She was silent, her face and eyes lifted to the starry heavens. The perfume of the flowers, the silence of the evening, and her sweet and chaste ecstasy so touched me that, impelled by an irresistible force, I reached my lips towards hers. My movement was instantaneous, but I failed to carry out the purpose. She turned away her face, and my lips only brushed against a lock of her hair. And then she immediately moved away and seated herself beside her mother. After 40 years, this comes back to me as if it just happened. Her face had an expression neither of displeasure nor of joy, but a certain somewhat of sorrow was there, which seemed an answer to all that I had been saying. When she perceived that I was serious and a little mortified, she said with calm benignity,
"Do you like verbena?"
"Oh, yes, I like it so much." Then, quickly rising, she cut off a sprig, put it in the buttonhole of my coat, and said,
"There, that looks well."
I took my leave, and going away, I said to her, "Addio," and not "Arrivederla." The 7th of September, 1836, on the vigil of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, I married my good Marina in the church of Sant'Ambrogio. This was, in truth, the great event of my life, and that which exercised the most salutary influence over my studies, over my peace, and over the prosperity and morality of my family. My new existence being thus assured, I began to think seriously how to carry out and give real form to the dream of all my life, which resolved itself into this, to be a sculptor. My young wife was timid and sought to persuade me that I was very well as I was. To my dear wife, for she above all others was nearest my heart, and on her account it behooved me to take care of what I was doing, I kept repeating, "My good Marina, listen. I risk nothing. I do not lose my skill as a woodcarver, and if I only study sculpture in the off hours of my work, this very study may be useful to me as a carver. And if I succeed in becoming a sculptor, I shall be able to earn more and acquire reputation and enable you to live well and to give up your trade. Say, would this not be a good thing?" And she would look at me sadly and, gently smiling, would say,
But we are very well off as we are.
In the meantime, in view of an offer by a Signore Maggi to give me some drawings and designs to copy, I went to his studio in the Liceo di Candelli, and he gave me some heads in light and dark from the Transfiguration of Raphael, which I copied, working at them early in the morning and in the evenings. Having finished these rapidly, and to his satisfaction, he gave me, plate by plate, the whole course of anatomy of Professor Sabatelli, done in red chalk. In this task, I was so interested that I worked till very late at night, until I had attained such facility and knowledge that after sketching in the general outlines, I at once finished them without requiring to make a rough copy. Signore Maggi was surprised that I was able so easily to turn off every day a copy of one of these drawings of arms, legs, and torsi, which were of life size. Afterwards, he gave me a number of the so-called accademie, which are nude studies of the entire figure, and these too I drew rapidly and with increasing taste, and so enamored was I of them that I afterwards repeated them at the shop upon any fragment of paper or wood, drawing them in all their attitudes from memory. I made, as I was well aware, very rapid progress, and I longed for the moment when the master should say to me that it was time to begin to model. In fact, he soon suggested this. It was therefore arranged that I should go to him during all the off hours of my work, and this I did. I will not stop to note the number of hands, feet, and heads that he made me copy. I will only say that my life was most exhausting, and my wife, poor dear, had to suffer for it. She had to wait for dinner, and I was often so late that I only had time to swallow up a little soup and a piece of bread, and then rush back to the shop. When I remember this life of mine, with its painful anxieties and struggles, it makes me angry to see some of the youths of today, with every opportunity and all their time, and without a care in the world, either for their family or for anything or person, who rot in idleness, assume the airs of scorn for others, even for their masters, and then swear out against adverse fortune, and deplore their genius crushed and unrecognized, and similar insipidities. My 2 hours of rest during the day, which were from 1 to 3, were thus occupied. 1 hour was given to study, and the other was but just sufficient to enable me to go from my shop, take my dinner, and then return to the shop. It was indeed a life full of agitations, anxieties, fears, and privations, but animated with what joyous hopes! Every evening when I came back from my work, I devoted myself at home to making anatomical drawings from casts, while my wife did her ironing in the same room, and I drew until the hour of supper came. It was a pure, sweet pleasure to me to see that strong and lively creature coming and going with her flat iron from the fireplace to the table, and gaily ironing and singing as she smoothed and beat with the flat iron on the linen, while her mother sat silently spinning in the corner. Truly, that blessed woman was right when she said we are so happy as we are, for one of the purest joys that cheers my present life is the memory of those days. In the opinion of my master, Signore Maggi, I had arrived at the point in my studies that I could be permitted to make portraits from life. Accordingly, he proposed that I should find some friend who had time and patience to stand for me as a model. I soon found one, and this was the first bust I modeled. The likeness was good, and Maggi and the others began to have a strong faith in my future. Encouraged by this trial from life, I determined to make a statuette of small dimensions. The subject, which was given to me by Maggi, was Santa Filomena, standing with her head and eyes turned towards heaven, one hand on her breast, and the other holding a bunch of lilies, while the anchor, the sign of her martyrdom, lay at her feet. The statuette was liked, and I pleased myself with executing it in wood, and finished it with great care of handling and delicacy of detail. It was exhibited at the Accademia delle Belle Arti in 1838, and it was praised by distinguished artists such as Benvenuti and Bartolini, and the latter recalled it to me when, sometimes afterwards, I went to ask for work in his studio, and he said, "Believe me, my dear sir, if I had any work to give you to do, I would give it with pleasure, for I have seen that statuette of yours, which shows that you have intelligence and love." My Santa Filomena was liked by artists and by those who were not artists, but no purchaser presented himself, and I was anxious to sell it, not only for the sake of a little money, which would have been very opportune, but still more for the satisfaction of my amore proprio as an artist. But the purchaser did not come, and I was obliged to place my statuette in the magazine of antiquities of the brothers Pacetti, on the ground floor of the Borghese Palace in the Via del Palagio. After this work, Maggi advised me to begin work in marble. This cost me a little trouble, practiced as I was in carving wood, which, though is a softer material, is more ungrateful and irresponsive. After a few weeks' practice, I was able to execute some works and to assure myself that henceforward, whenever I wished, I could go from one material to the other. Remember, however, that I then did not even dream of becoming an artist. I only hoped to succeed as a workman in marble, as I was then in wood. The idea of becoming an artist came to me afterwards, slowly and by degrees, the appetite growing, as the saying is, by eating. Or I should rather say I was driven along to it. But let us proceed regularly. At Maggi's I had as much work as I wished. I had already finished for him 2 busts, one of the Grand Duke in Roman drapery, according to the style then in vogue among the academic sculptors who dressed in Roman or Greek costume, the portrait of their own uncle or godfather. The other bust was of an older woman whom I did not know. Work enough I had, but naturally I wished to earn something by it, and this was soon spoken of. I understood very well that the master has a kind of right to all the profits of the first works of the pupil, but with me this went on so long that at last he saw its impropriety, and he proposed to engage me to finish the group of Charity which he made for the chapel of the Poggio Imperiale, as a substitute for that wonderful work of Bartolini which is still admired in the Palatine Gallery. But Maggi's proposition was in every way impossible to accept, as he only agreed to pay me when the work was completed, and that is to say that I and my family were to go for at least a year without anything to eat. I tried here and there, but I could not make a satisfactory arrangement, and I had to resign myself to the making of candlesticks. I had now become a father. My wife had given me a little girl, whom I lost afterwards when she was 7 years old. Let us consider for a moment the state of my mind at this time. I felt within me an unconquerable inclination for the study of sculpture, and even as a child I gave vent to my feelings as well as I was able. As I increased in years, the more this desire was repressed and opposed, whether by my poverty or the aversion of my father, the more it developed into a settled passion. But after the progress I had made in my studies gave me a right to hope, and my masters had encouraged me, and I had acquired some skill in working the marble, no work was given for me to do. Nor was this all. I was humiliated at last, being told by a workman to whom I applied, who was the administrator of the studio of some foreign artist, that there was nothing for me to do there because the work in that studio was so difficult as to be beyond my ability. I swallowed this bitter mouthful, but I did not despair. Not only did I not despair, but I determined by study and force of will to prove that I was right and they were wrong. Since the first prophecies that I never should be good for anything as a woodcarver had proved false, this also, which was both a humiliation and an insult, might prove to be untrue. My poor wife saw that my mind was greatly disturbed, and, with her sweetness, strove to calm me by representing to me that we were fairly well off and without troubles, and exhorted me to drive from my head a thought which was rendering my life bitter to me. These words, dictated by love, made me still more unhappy, but dissimulating and caressing her, I told her that she was right. One day in the studio of Maggi, I and another young man were modeling together a man's torso which had been cast from nature. A friend of Maggi, a painter, as he passed by us, paused, and after looking at our 2 copies, said, turning to my rival and patting him gently on the shoulder, "I am delighted. This is an artist." Then, turning to me, with an expression of regret, said, "Arrivederla." My good reader, do you think that made me despair? No, by the Lord, I tell you rather that these words were seared upon my brain as with a red-hot iron, and there they still remain. And they did me a great deal of good. The professor who spoke them, yes, he was a professor, 3 years afterwards embraced me in the academia. And my rival? My rival is perfectly sound in health and is fatter and more vigorous than I am, but he is not a sculptor. So, my dear young artist, courage in the face of poverty and oppression and abuse and contempt, and even, remember this, of blandishments and flatteries, which are more destructive even than abuse and contempt. But be careful to consider well what your vocation really is, and do not allow yourself to be deluded by false appearances. It is absolutely necessary that your calling should be imperious, tenacious, persistent, that it should enter into all your thoughts, that it should give its form and pressure to all your feelings, that it should not abandon you even in your sleep, and that it should drive from your memory your hour of dinner, your appointments, your ease, your pleasures. If, when you take a walk in the country, the hills and groves do not awaken in you in the least the idea that it would be pleasant to own them, but, instead of this, if you feel yourself enamored by the beautiful harmony of nature, with its varied outlines and swelling bosoms and slopes sadly illuminated by the setting sun, and all seems to you an exquisite picture, then hope. If at the theater you see a drama represented and you feel impelled to judge within yourself whether this or that character is well played, whether the gestures, the expression of face, and the inflections of voice are such as properly belong to the character, and accord with the affections that move him or the passions which agitate him, then hope. If, while you are walking along and you see the face of a beautiful woman, and if it does not immediately awaken in you the idea of a statue with its name and expression, but on the contrary you will idly or improperly admire it, then fear. If, in reading of a pathetic incident, you feel your heart grow tender, if the triumph of pride and arrogance rouse your scorn, then hope. And if you do not feel your faculties debilitated by the long and thorny path of study, but on the contrary, tempered and strengthened every day by constant and patient labor, then hope, hope, hope. If you have property, attend to the management of it. If you are poor, learn some trade. It is better to be a good carpenter than a bad artist. In my own case, I armed myself with stout patience and pursued my ordinary work of wood-carving, and when I returned home in the evening, I applied myself to study, and, in the simple and frank conversation of my wife, felt a calm come over my agitated mind, and my powers, enervated by ungrateful labor, were thus restored. But the opportunity which was to launch me once and forever in art was already near, and I seized upon it with all my strength, hope, and love. Many and sad were the first steps against opposition and division, but I pushed on, and I have never stopped since. Professore Ulisse Cambi, who had seen me modeling in Maggi's studio and who had his own studio close by, now began to talk to me about the triennial competition in sculpture, which took place precisely in this year, and he proposed that I should go in for it, and hoped that I should succeed. But even if I did not, he said, at all events, the study incident to it would be no loss to me. Flattered by the suggestion, which showed that he had some confidence in me, I replied that I would think of it and would speak about it to Maggi, who might possibly lend me one of his rooms which he did not use, and also give me his assistance. I spoke to him on the subject, but I did not find him at all disposed to favor the project. In the first place, he told me that he could not give me a room. Then, he did not think that I had gone on sufficiently far in my studies to be able to attempt such a competition. And finally, that he would not undertake to direct my work. This answer, having been repeated to Cambi, told me that he was convinced that I should succeed, and that if Maggi would neither give me a room nor superintend my work, he would do both. And this he did. The subject of the bas-relief for the competition was the Judgment of Paris, and required of 5 figures: Paris, Venus, Minerva, Juno, and Mercury. I made a sketch, but it did not please Cambi, and taking a piece of paper, he sketched with a pen a new composition, saying, "That, I think, will do very well." And then I made a new sketch founded upon this by Cambi. Someone will now say, "Oh, this is not right. You ought to have worked out an idea of your own and not one of your master's." Agreed. But these considerations will come afterwards. For the present, let us go on. It was necessary to come to a decision, and to take into consideration that the work required much time and could not be completed in my off hours, as I had hitherto done with my other studies, and also that money would be required to pay for the models, so that as it would be necessary to give less time to my ordinary work, I should earn less, while I should have need of more money in order to pay the models. The problem was a difficult one, and at first sight not easily solved. The reader will remember the brothers Pacetti, in whose shop I had sold the Santa Filomena. Well, one of these, Tonino, had often said to me that if I would work for them, they would give me anything to do that I might prefer, whether cornices rich with figures and putti and arabesques, or coffers and chests, or whatever I liked with figures, with the prices agreed upon and liberty to work when and how I liked. The offer was excellent, as you see, but it involved leaving my old master, Sani, and I was affectionately attached to him, and he and all the shop were attached to me, and on this account I felt repugnance to leaving the place and the persons who had helped me on when I was a child. So, thanking Pacetti, I repeatedly refused this offer, but now it was necessary to come to a decision between 2 alternatives, either to abandon the competition and remain in the shop, or abandon the shop and accept the offer of the brothers Pacetti. I spoke of this to my good Marina, who, at first, did not look upon it at all favorably, saying if I left the shop, which had always given me work, I should find myself left in the lurch by the other, in spite of all the fine promises of gain and liberty and the like. But at last, seeing that I was decided, she contented herself with saying,
"Do as you think best."
"O blessed woman, may God reward thee." Now, when I stated to old Sani my determination to leave his shop, angry as a hornet, he said, "Do as you like," and he spoke to me no more the whole day. The next day, however, more softened, but still severe, he asked me the reason of this strange resolution, and I told him. Then he proposed an increase of salary and a diminution of work, and at last agreed, I must do justice to this good man, to allow me to have all the hours which were necessary for the competition. But I had already made my contract with Pacetti, and decided upon a work of my own choice, and arranged the room given to me by Pacetti, and I could not withdraw from it. Let me say that if in my studio I enjoyed complete liberty of imagination and action, and if my works met with such success and were so praised as to give me consolation, matters did not go on so well in the studio Cambi, where I was modeling for the competition. Scarcely had I put my foot into that studio when I became timid, embarrassed, and almost fearful, for the professor would not leave me free to see and execute from the life as I saw it. Now, I do not say that he was wrong. I only say that thus feeling my hands bound to the will of another rendered me hesitating and discontented. I should have preferred a studio of my own, and after I had sketched out as well as I could my own ideas, then to have my master come in to correct me. But there he was, always. And he was not content with correcting me by words alone, but he would take the modeling tool and go on and model what I ought to have modeled myself. My work might be done with difficulty, but if I could have done it all myself as I wished, I should have been much happier, and my hand would have been better seen in it. the hand of a youth without skill indeed, but still desirous to do and to learn. And I should also have been spared the annoyance of hearing that the work was not done by me, but by Professor Comby. Now, Comby is a very dear friend of mine, and I do not mean in the least to reprove him for what he did, but it is my duty to state the facts clearly just as they are. And I take this occasion to say a few words as to what I consider a master should do in directing his young pupils. One of the commonest faults with young scholars is their slothfulness in trying to discover for themselves their own way to express their ideas. For the most part, they are completely deficient in this, and prefer to seek among the works of their master or some other master for their subjects, types, and movements. And thus, with little fatigue and less honor, they only succeed in giving a colorless reminiscence of works already known. And one of the faults of the master is this, not only to allow his scholars to imitate and steal from him, but what is worse, to desire to impose upon them his own works as models. Well, I return to my narrative. In my studio, I pursued my artistic life freely and happily, with power to select the work I was to do, to carry out my own designs in whatever style I liked, and to almost fix their prices. In this way, with only a half-day's work, I was able to carry home my ordinary earnings for the maintenance of my family, and beyond this I had 2 francs over to pay my model for the remainder of the day, which I spent on my basso-rilievo. My daily life, therefore, was gay and free in my studio, timorous and gloomy in the studio Comby, and peaceful, glad, and quiet all the evening at home. But for all this, the bitterness had to come. The other competitor, Ludovico Caselli, was already hinting it about that the basso-rilievo was not made by me, but that Professor Comby had worked on it. Caselli was modeling under the direction of Professor Pampaloni, but I never complained that Pampaloni worked on it, although there were some who affirmed that he did. I kept my peace, and resolved formally in my own mind that whatever should be the issue of this competition, I would again make an attempt the next year. When the time of the exhibition and the decision approached, I began to hear contemptuous and insolent rumors which, whether I failed or was successful, would equally afflict me. To this is to be added that my poor mother was suffering from a very severe illness, an illness indeed that carried her in a few days to her grave. I remember as something that still pierces my heart the interest she showed during that illness for me, for my competition, and for my triumph, as she called it, and it seemed as if this belief of my loving mother gave a certain alleviation to the terrible anguish of her disease, which every day grew worse and worse. This was in the first days of September 1840. On Sunday, the 15th, the decision was to be given, and my poor mother was at the point of death. What I felt in my heart may be imagined. It cannot be told. The instant I heard that the prize had been given to me, I ran to my mother, from whom I had of late been somewhat separated, with almost a hope that this good news might bring her back to life again, and in fact, in hearing the news, her face became radiant, her cheeks glowed, her eyes, which for a time had seen nothing, became animated and seemed to gaze at me. And then she stretched out her arms and, pressing me to her, said,
"Now, I die willingly."
She lived a few days longer, and then, comforted by the sacrament of our holy religion, died. She had finished her short life of about 50 years in the restrictions of poverty and the bitterness of one of the greatest misfortunes, blindness. God has taken her to the joy of his infinite mercy. The conflict of judgment among the professors of the academy at the competition were tempestuous, and the result extraordinary. The votes were divided thus: 10 votes were given for my model, 4 or 5 to that of my competitor, and then there were 11 votes for a division of the prize. I thought that votes for division could not properly be given, and at all events, as I received 10 and the other 4, I considered myself the superior. But no, The legal advisor declared that the number of 11 was superior to the number 10, and as 11 had voted for the division, that the prize must be divided. But the matter did not end there. My competitor, not satisfied with his prize, went about saying that it was not I who competed, that he did not know who I was, nor where I had studied, and he threatened to challenge me to I know not what trial in design or modeling, and I answered that I intended to continue to study, and that naturally we should be measured against each other often, if he chose to have it so, and this put an end to it. But in the opinion of the young students at that time, there still remained a doubt whether that work was all grist from my mill, and in consequence I had a strong desire to do something by myself in my own studio. In order to put to an end all of this gossiping, I put up a figure of life size, representing a drunken and youthful bacchante leaning against the trunk of a tree as if half falling, while she smiled and held to her lips a goblet. The difficulty of the subject was as great as my inexperience. The tender age of the model, who could not be made to stand still, the difficult and fatiguing attitude, my own total want of practice in setting up the irons and clay, the smallness of the room, the deficiency of light, were obstacles which conquered at last all my poor capacity, and my figure fell, and I had not the courage to put it up again. And it was all the better that I did not. The youthful bacchante fell down, and as I have said, it is well that it did, and this I say now, but then I was much vexed, both on account of the accident itself and for the unpleasant talk that it gave rise to. But after all, things are what they really are, and not what we think them to be. I was, however, consoled by a commission. Very small indeed, but it seemed to raise my depressed spirits. And it was this, to make the 4 plaster caryatids of the Royal Box of the Rossini Theatre in Livorno. I would not have mentioned this humble work did it not give me occasion to know one thing which the young men of today seem to have forgotten. Now, it is common for the young sculptors of today to scorn and sneer at any work that is offered to them which they think beneath that skill and capacity which they suppose themselves to possess, and they will not, as they say, abase themselves to mere work in plaster. If anyone orders of them a bust or a statue in plaster, their pretense is so excessive that they deem it an insult. Now, I say the material counts for nothing, and a plaster statue, merely for decoration, well executed, is worth more than a statue in marble or bronze which is ill executed. Now, undoubtedly, if one could choose, he would reject the statue in plaster and accept that in marble. Always, however, recognizing that the one essential thing is to do his work well. But I was not given this choice, and I accepted the humble commission, and executed it with zealous love. There was this, too, of good in the commission. It might induce me to believe that I should have made a far better statue had I been given more time and more means to make one of my own selection. And I said, if I have been able to make these statues in a month, with 30 or 40 lire to pay for my models, how much better might I do in 5 or 6 months with much more money? The question reduces itself, then, to time and money. This humble work was of great importance to me, and I recommend it to the attention of those young artists who consider themselves humiliated by small commissions. No, do not let them be alarmed either by the subject or the material, and if they should receive an order even for a terracotta mask for a fountain, provided it be well made, they will acquire by it praise and new and worthier orders, so long as their sole endeavor is to do their work well. And this concludes the first half of the reading of the Autobiography of Giovanni Dupr&. Make sure you tune in next week for the second half. It's going to get very interesting and fun, and it certainly won't be as depressing and sad as the first half. And I want to thank very much the talented Chiara Perondi for her excellent portrayal of the several female characters in today's reading. Now don't forget to check out additional content at our YouTube channel for The Sculptor's Funeral and also on our Facebook page. When you check it out, you can join up and join in the conversation and do that whole online networking thing with like-minded sculptors and sculpture lovers from all over the globe. You can ask a question at our Facebook page, you can post current events, you can get to know me and your fellow sculptors a little bit better. And don't forget, you can also go to the website of the podcast, thesculptorsfuneral.com, where you can not only listen to the entire back catalog of episodes, but you can also visit the image galleries, which I make to go along with most episodes. And while you are there, finally, you can click on the Blick Art Supplies link, which takes you to the Blick Art Supplies website, where you can support the podcast simply by buying from Blick. And for that, I thank you very much. Thank you again for listening, and have a productive week.